Welcome to About Art. I'm Heidi Zuckerman. Today, I'm speaking with the designer who has fundamentally rethought how design reaches people and who it's for. Ben Uyeda is a designer, a maker, and the founder of Homemade Modern. After co-founding an award-winning architecture firm and teaching at institutions like Cornell and Northeastern, he made a radical shift, stepping away from traditional pathways to share design directly with a global audience. Over the past decade, his work has reached more than 500 million people, and his open source designs, freely available, have been built on 6 continents. His practice challenges the idea that design belongs to an elite few, instead offering tools, ideas, and access to anyone willing to engage. And yet, even with this populist approach, his work has been recognized and exhibited by major institutions, including the Vitra Design Museum, the Anchorage Museum of Art, and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Today, we'll talk about access, authorship, materials, and what it means to design not just objects, but possibilities. Ben, I'm so pleased to have you here today.
Hi, Heidi. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine. Just a nice, kind of a cloudy morning in the desert for a change.
Yeah, it's a little cloudy here in Laguna too. So not bad. It's kind of a beautiful color, actually.
I like it. It's better for filming outside when we had a little bit of cloud cover to diffuse the light a bit.
Yeah. I was looking at some of your videos this morning, and there the color palette is very calm and there's like variation, but I'm really interested in kind of a limited palette range. And that's been one of my kind of design strategies over time. So I was noticing that about your practice too.
It's kind of like going to the grocery store. If you want to eat healthy, you shop healthy at the grocery store, and then you're contained within that in your refrigerator.
Yep. I think that's true. So are you good to go?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So one of the reasons why I was extra excited about talking to you today is because it feels like you made a really significant decision to step away from both traditional architecture practice and academia. And, it's one of the things I've been kind of managing in my own life and career, which is things that other people really desire and want, and then being in integrity in terms of being interested in access and making what you're interested in and what you have to share and what you have to offer just widely accessible. So I'm curious for you about that shift, and maybe start with what you feel that those structures were not allowing you to do.
Yeah. So it's funny growing up in kind of a relatively poor, on the fringe of lower middle class sort of upbringing, but being interested in art, design, architecture from an early age, it always struck me as like, well, how do you get the opportunity to do that? Right? Like, who comes up with these commissions? How do you make a living painting or drawing or designing or doing creative work? We didn't know anyone. Our family wasn't friends with people that made a living doing that way. So it seemed very unreachable or impractical. So as I got older and started to learn a little bit more about the world, I still really felt strongly that incentives matter. And just because the design world and the art world don't always talk about how they actually pay the bills, it's still there. And you look all the way back to the Renaissance and you're like, well, the Medici family was really just like buying cultural prestige. Maybe they were really into the work they were commissioning. Maybe they were very difficult clients that just wanted to stroke their ego. And you see that the artist's interests were following the money. It's almost, maybe in the cave painting era that didn't happen. But almost after that, it does seem like it follows the institutions, the powers, and the flow of funding. So I studied architecture. I taught architecture and sustainable design at Cornell and Northeastern universities for a while. And then we started the architecture firm Zero Image Design, which is still going strong, offices in New York and Boston. Wonderful firm, does, I think, some of the best residential sustainable work in the country. But you're sort of limited to serving high net worth individuals or well-funded corporations because those are the people that can pay for design as a service. And so even though we were kind of ahead of schedule and launching a firm and getting great creative opportunities within that profession, it still seemed dictated by the financial boundaries of it's kind of like legal services. There's people that do sort of pro bono stuff, but that's normally not getting the sharpest, highest billing minds. And then there's people that make a great personal sacrifice in the form of being a public defender or a prosecutor. But when you look at the field of architecture, they only design about I think it's less than 5% of the homes built in America have direct involvement from an architect. So it's kind of like private chefs don't exactly feed the world, except for Jose Andres. Uh, and that's why I think he's so laudable and gets so much attention is because he has the opportunity to serve the high end of the market and he
Mhm.
chooses to serve the opposite. And I think that's why he's such a beloved and notable figure. When I kind of first stepped away from the practice of architecture, it was to create a tech company. And this was around sort of 2007, as kind of the second wave of the dot coms. And it was about that idea of if we change who our client is, we will change the way we design. If we change the incentive, we will change the process. And so what we did is said, what we want to do is give good design that's more sustainable than what's being built on a daily basis. We want to give that away for free. How do we do that? Not as a nonprofit, but as a sort of player in the market. And what we realized is about 30% of the homes built in the US came from stock house plans, just basically kind of like recipe books that have been around for a long time. There's just I don't know how many people have made, probably a billion people have made the Toll House chocolate chip cookie recipe, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I was thinking about that. And I was like, wow, that creating that recipe and making it available created usage, which then sort of reinforced people buying Toll House chocolate chips. They put their brand right into the recipe. Could be any other chocolate chips, but that was smart. And it allowed them to give away this technical information for free. And as I said, well, architects don't make buildings. We make drawings, and those drawings inform and instruct how the building is created. We make the recipe. And I said, the internet's here now, and it's the most impressive tool for distributing information since the printing press. We should use it to distribute better recipes for building. So we launched a website called freegreen.com. All the houses were designed to a much higher energy standard than what sort of code requires. And we would actually show people how they would save money if they built to these standards. And our business model relied on, just like Toll House chocolate chips, product placing better insulation, more efficient HVAC equipment right into that. And so very quickly, we became the largest supplier of home designs, even though we only had 3 employees at the time, simply by changing the incentive, using these new technological platforms, and then taking some steps. I did that, and that got acquired in around 2014. And then a lot of our media partners were talking about how difficult it was to pivot to video. And I said, well, I got time on my hands and I need a new project. And I repeated the same process of sharing design as a type of media, but this time in the form of video.
So interesting. So this idea about scale is really interesting. And I've talked before about how my husband caught my attention when he said he wanted to impact the consciousness of a billion people. And I was like, a billion people? Like, I don't even know what a billion is, you know? Like, how do you even conceptualize that kind of number? And your work has reached hundreds of millions of people, right? Which is totally extraordinary. So I'm curious how you think about scale, not just in terms of audience, but in terms of impact.
So I think scale and efficiency are like the tools of the business world and their focus. I think for the creative arts and design fields, you have to think about scaling a little bit different because we all know that creativity doesn't scale well. And I think restaurants are like the best example of this. It's hard to find a restaurant chain that meets the quality, care, and craft of like our favorite chef-led restaurant. It's very hard to scale creative. Now, that being said, there's a natural instinct to grow. Nothing is as motivating as previous success. I find is that like you get a little bit and you're like, oh, well, I made mistakes in that one. The next one's going to be even better. So the way I've thought about scaling is I'm not great at efficiency as most creatives aren't. We're not good at thinking in the tiny improvements in repetition. I think that's I like to feel that happen with the tools in my hands, not necessarily plan that out in a spreadsheet, but I still want growth. I still want sort of excitement. I don't want to feel like I'm plateauing. And so instead, I think of it in terms of escalation rather than scaling. And I think if you look at the film industry, you'll see this kind of escalation pattern quite often. Someone might do some commercial work where they shoot a commercial and it's not what their creative vision is at all, but they get paid, but their craftsmanship is excellent. Someone may be wanting to do a music video, partners with them, and they get a lot of sort of creative exploration opportunities. Music video is bigger than a commercial. And then that may get them enough sort of out to sort of go and do like a small film, which then gets them into a festival, which then they get their first feature film. And then they get the sort of, big commercial film after that. So they're still just a filmmaker. They're still just a director, but they're kind of escalating up the size of what they're doing. They're not trying to go from making one commercial to making 100 commercials the next year. And I think that's sort of the way I sort of approach it. So my favorite story on the internet early on was this. It was this story of this man, and he started with a paperclip and he traded it for a cigarette lighter, all on like eBay and Craigslist. Then he traded the cigarette lighter for like a stapler. And he traded the stapler for like a toaster. And he worked his way up from the paperclip, just making one trade that was mostly in his favor. And each trade escalated the value slightly of what he had. And so he only had to make like 20 to 30 trades to go from a paperclip to a car and then finally a house. And then I think he gave the house away, which is phenomenal. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to just start designing something with exactly what I have in front of me. And the first project video that I ever made was I turned leftover wine bottles into a series of vases and planters for houseplants. Then the next project got a little bit bigger. And the next project got a little bit bigger. The video started getting traction. I got some power tool sponsors, and that allowed me to get bigger. And in about like 5 years, I was able to start with a vase, but end up making a series of project videos around building things the size of a staircase, and then eventually a whole house. And then from a house, it took us about another 5 to 6 years to design and build a whole 65-room hotel on 180 acres. So it's just, there's no massive, the house to the hotel was a pretty big jump, but all of the jumps made sense, right? But it's so crazy to think that you could escalate from a vase to 12 years later or so, 65-room hotel on 180 acres.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I have studied at the Stegan Leadership Academy for some years, and when you are accepted into the advanced leadership program, you're basically making a commitment for a decade of self, consciousness and betterment. And when you're starting off, you're like, oh my God, a decade, that sounds so long, right? But there's that quote, it's, I'm sure, misattributed to a variety of different people, that people, overestimate what they can do in a year, but underestimate what they can do in, fill in the blank 10 or whatnot. And that idea of repetitive practice is something that I'm really committed to. And for me, it started with meditation. I was like, I'm just going to try for 10 days. If I can do it for 10 days, then I'll go from there. Then, okay. Then I'm like, all right, I'm going to do it for 30 days. Then I'm going to, and then it just becomes, part of your life. But it's that idea of not kind of getting too far ahead of yourself, but also being curious. And you said that, you want excitement, you want growth. And I'm curious, what are some of the things that you're excited about, like right now? Like what do you get excited about that gets you up out of bed, like right now?
I think it's looking at it's interesting, right? I was talking to some AI companies about sponsorship, and they were asking me like how I'm using the tools. And it's funny, like in the business world, they look for opportunity by looking for where demand has already been proven. But if you're looking for where demand has already been proven in the form of sales and stuff like that, you end up copying something and then probably getting some point of diminishing returns after you invest into sort of producing something that's already popular. You see this all the time with movies, right? Like one asteroid movie comes out and then another one comes out. Or I think we're seeing that right now with the superhero movies. They're really big for a while, so everyone starts investing all their money into superheroes. The supply gets oversaturated and people want something like weapons, which is way more low budget, more lo-fi, but feels more visceral and real. So I think what's exciting is, and I think this is where creatives really do well, is they don't look at where the proven demand is. They look conceptually at what are the elements that make something in demand, and then they look at where there isn't supply. And I think that's what I was trying to explain to these startup people was the potential of your tool. If I use Google, it tells me what's already been written. What I want AI to do with search is to tell me what's like the things that have already been written, but hasn't been written yet, right? So it's just looking for the absence of something rather than the proven track record of a bunch of things.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
trying to figure out those things, and the kind of thread that we're pulling right now is, I don't know, like every time I go to Soho or downtown LA in the arts district, I'll like walk into some really cool galleries. In Soho, there's a bunch of little ones. In downtown LA, there's like Hauser and Wirth, which I always just find incredible. It's also nice that you can get a drink there. But what I'm struck is like, it's always a pleasant experience, but it almost feels like whatever the exhibition's out could be sort of interchangeable. It's almost more of the atmosphere of having a coffee in one hand, strolling around, that sort of pedestrian curiosity and seeing like really cool stuff. Great experience, but I feel like it almost doesn't matter when I go. I don't need to look at which shows. It's almost a texture rather than an event. And so when I look at and then on the flip side, when I see sort of the bigger monuments like the Eiffel Tower and those kind of things, I've already seen them so much in the form of Instagram and things like that. I was just at the pyramids for Art Egypt. And it was my first time seeing them, but I was like, yep, I kind of already seen them so many times that it
Yeah.
kind of took a little bit away. So if I think about where there's a lot of supply at either one of those ends, where I think that there isn't a lot of supply is the sort of middle scale. And that's what we're really excited about right now is how do we do stuff that's smaller than a building, but bigger than any piece of furniture. And so the moon pad was one of our first sort of experiments into this kind of area. And what we like about it, one, we have the opportunity for it, and that we have a big canvas, 100 acres that we're using for a sculpture garden and art park right next to the Reset Hotel. We can make things that are kind of inhabitable at a scale that isn't common, but feels significant strictly by the lack of supply, at least for a lot of people that are visiting the area. They don't get to see that. It's not the kind of thing that would be in their wealthy friend's home, and a little more accessible to some of the corporate art that might be in front of their office.
Yeah.
And so we think that scale is a huge opportunity, and it's kind of a fun one to build out.
Yeah. There's definitely something about proximity that is engaging. And it's interesting, this idea of like what's replicable and how do you do it and what are people looking for. And I've talked a lot about this idea of spending my life trying to get people to care about something that mostly they don't, which is art. And how do you bridge that with things that people feel comfortable with? Like, right? Everyone feels comfortable with music, different types of music, but like whether it's your mom or like your Uber driver, whatever, everyone's got music going. And that is such an accessible form of creativity and culture, right? Or movies. Yeah, they go up and down in terms of whether people want to go out, be with other people, sit in a dark room or watch from their home. But that idea of kind of storytelling and that narrative arc, people are familiar with, where they watch TV, right? And so there are things around art and the presentation of it. I think you're right. Like when I was running the Orange County Museum of Art, people didn't come because they wanted to see a specific show. I mean, sometimes they did, like when we had Daniel Arsham or the, YSL show. But for the most part, people came because they felt welcome. And we did that through what color the people at visitor services were wearing, the smell, the scent we created for the museum, like all of these kind of intangibles, right? That became very key to welcoming people. But that idea of creating spaces where people want to come, I think is as important, maybe even more than what they're actually going to see once they get there.
Well, I mean, art and music are a great point of comparison now. And I think that they underline that incentives do really matter. So if you music reaches a lot of people because the incentives financially are to reach a lot of people. There's that Wu-Tang album that sold to some asshole for like a lot of money, and he just kept it and no one lived in it, but no one's heard it, right? He's the only one. That's much more like the model for some of my fine artist friends. And
Yeah.
so it kind of makes sense that art isn't consumed or interacted with to the same frequency if the price points for the most esteemed practitioners are all at the high end, right? Even if you look at the biggest music artists, sure, their ticket prices for the live experiences have gone way up, but their streaming cost to sort of get them is less expensive than what it was when I bought my first cassette single from my Sony Walkman. And so I think music's business model has focused on accessibility. And I think you see this to a certain degree in film, but I think even more in art, that there's a distrust and I think healthy sort of caution around sort of mass market and broad audiences. It's almost like it
Right.
can't be profound if everyone likes it. It's funny when I talk to some of my artist friends and I was like, what do you have against, why do you hate Banksy so much? When you distill a lot of the arguments, some of them completely legitimate and well articulated, a big part of that though is just on who likes it. And I think this question of taste, I think the sort of cultivation of taste is the biggest destructional force against creativity. People often wonder why kids are more creative than adults. It's because they haven't cultivated taste yet. That's why they're so creative when they're cooking, because they'll throw anything on the sandwich as long as it's like strikes their fancy. Once you start to really invest in taste, you start putting all these limitations on your creativity. I don't know. I feel like it starches a little the fun out of it, but I guess the gatekeeping is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, gatekeeping is an interesting question. And I started doing these invitations just put out on social for people to meet me in a certain place to look at art together. And it just says, like, come look at art with me. And we just do it for free. So, we only go to a place where people don't have to pay to get in. And it's really interesting, like who makes the time to show up and the conversations. And one of the things that came up recently is this idea of who makes the decisions. And for a long time, I was in that position to be able to make those decisions. And I always took it really seriously. And I understood the profound impact of having that kind of platform and wanting to always use it for good. Anyway, so you also are interested in this idea of free, right? Though you've talked about incentives and this idea of making your designs freely available for people around the world to build them. And I'm curious about this idea of authorship and what it means to you to have your work replicated and also adapted.
The copying question comes up a lot. I remember the first time I did a concrete Pokemon a very, very, very long time ago and posted it on Instagram. And later, when some similar things happened from other people, a bunch of people sort of DM'd me and being like, are you being copied? Aren't you angry? I've never seen artists get more upset than either when they're being copied. And sometimes when they think they're being copied, they're actually not being copied. But it creates this feeling of helplessness, of anger, of being wronged. I don't want to feel that way, whether it's legitimate or not. Even if it is legitimate, I don't want to wake up, look at my email, see something and be upset. I want to focus on making the new thing. So one, I think it's in my business interest to be prolific and focus on the next thing. In order for that to happen, I have to be excited, happy, healthy, and cheerful doing it. So it's not that I don't think that injustices happen. The most flagrant in my sort of world isn't when someone sort of takes one of my designs and copies it. It's when someone actually like downloads the video and then reposts it, claiming authorship of the video itself. But even that happens on the internet. So I think I don't want to be focused on what I've already created. I think that's when you stagnate as a creative, was when you start looking at your own past and you start trying to, prune your own roses. Like, no, experiment with cross-pollinating and breeding and grafting and get more land and try to grow new things and build a greenhouse because that'll change your climate. There's so much to do that if you keep sort of manicuring your own legacy, I think you're losing out on the fun. And that's when artists get old. The minute they start looking at their au revoir, and it's just lame too.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think there's a couple of things about what you just said. One is this kind of practice of non-attachment, right? And allowing. And it's like, yeah, there are some nefarious people and, and for the most part, just keep moving forward, right? Like be a goldfish, right? The Ted Lasso quote, right? But there's also this kind of inherent generosity and I think courage that you're talking about, where if you're only replicating what you've already done because you're afraid that people won't like your new thing or whatnot, then it's self-limiting, right? And there's so many factors that are limiting in the world anyway, that if we practice self-limiting, then it's just way worse.
It's also, I mean, I do feel like a generosity feels great. And so there is that aspect. But I tend to be kind of skeptical when I hear someone, oh, let's just do it to be generous and that. So there is another side to this. It's also, I think, just smart, calculated, and strategic as well. And I think these things can be the same. You can do something that's generous and it can also be really smart. Um, and what I think that it does is if you give away something and allow people to sort of recreate it and actually show them how to make it, they have the opportunity to sort of imprint their own creative imprint, right? And so I think the best example of this was the first project where this really happened is I designed a 3-legged stool that could be made in a 5-gallon bucket. So a 5-gallon bucket is like the most basic bucket, that standard bucket size that you would get from Home Depot or Lowe's. If you take one of those plastic buckets and you put 2.5 inches of concrete in the bottom and just stick in 3 sticks, let the concrete harden, which holds the sticks in place. The day later, you pull out a 3-legged stool right out of the bucket. So I did that project, posted it, had a very small following at the time, but like within weeks, I saw people sort of posting their version of it. And they would try pigments in the concrete. They'd use different sticks that they find. They'd use old rebar left from a construction site. But there was this opportunity for them to sort of do something creative with the sort of prompt of the video that I posted. That felt good. And I think that helped me gain a lot of sort of traction because I created thousands of people that had spent physical time and effort and a small amount of money to buy the materials. It was like $5 at the time, and created something and for a lot of them, that was probably the biggest, most useful physical object they've ever made since they were in high school or
Wow.
wood shop. Yeah. So that feeling is really valuable, particularly in a connected sort of internet media landscape. If you have a bunch of people that whenever they see you post about something or they see your latest work show up online, they're thinking to that good feeling that you created, and you have all these advocates that you never charged them for anything and they got a lot out of you. And what they got from you is now sitting in their home. So using that as sort of a distribution method for goodwill was really important for sort of audience building and these kind of things. Now, it wasn't that calculated. It wasn't like I figured out, oh, I'll do this and I'll do this and then this will happen. But it was more just sort of generally trusting these kind of principles. Because I know that like, if there's an author that I've read their book, I want to go talk to them. They made me feel something and I spent a lot of time with their work, even though they don't know me at all. So yeah, if you and to a certain extent, I think that's why someone like Banksy has that broad base of popular support, is he took things out of there. It made so many people in my generation feel like, I don't know how many dudes that I went to design school with that were really into like cutting stencils and spray painting things and stuff like that. It gave them a toolkit to feel like they could do something. And the more significance that it got sort of culturally, the more they felt like they could participate in something culturally significant. And I think there's always this tension from artists and designers where they so want to differentiate themselves. But if you differentiate yourself so much, are you really going to create those sort of good feelings in a lot of people?
Yeah, it's so interesting because this idea that you're talking about is you're really enabling people to make something, and that idea of feeling useful and and that sense kind of pride that comes from making something. There aren't, I don't think, that many examples of that. I mean, sometimes it's cooking, right? If someone makes some bread and you can feed your family or whatnot, and you're like, oh, I didn't know how to do that. But this idea of the three-legged stool, like now people have somewhere to sit. And if they didn't have anywhere, maybe they were sitting on the floor or they were only sitting on their bed or their mattress, wherever that was. I mean, it's actually, it's a very simple idea in some ways, but it's incredibly profound too. Because, I was looking at some of the things I was showing my husband this morning, your spiral staircase. And I was like, oh, we need a spiral staircase. Like, we should do that. Right. And I mean, I don't know how to use any of those tools. And it makes it feel available, or at least I'm curious about doing something that maybe I thought I couldn't. And so that kind of inherent possibility that you offer, I think, is really powerful.
I felt like I've learned a lot from the world of cooking and food, right? And even if you look at it, if you open up Instagram right now, the type of content that really sparks imagination around food is not a beautifully plated thing from a Michelin star restaurant where the picture of perfection is sitting right in front of you. It's someone picking radishes and then washing them and then cooking on a fire over a pot. It's process oriented stuff. People like and engage in the process. And I think in the world of design and art, it's actually the more people that are amateurs at it, the better it is for the industry of the professionals. Meaning that the better I get at cooking, the more I appreciate a great restaurant because they're doing things that are just beyond me and they have the time and the connections to sort of acquire different ingredients that I don't have access to at my grocery store. But the more expertise I develop in a craft, the bigger fan I become of that craft at the highest level, right? Like as I started doing woodworking and building furniture, the more money I felt willing to spend on stuff that was well beyond my specific level of capabilities. Because you know what's funny? The people that always walk into or look at abstract modern art and then be like, I could do that, are people that have never tried to do that.
Yeah.
As soon as they tried to do that, and I've had a few
Yeah.
engineering friends do that, and I literally get them a canvas and we have a barbecue at my house, and I'm like, okay, no, go, yeah, no. Actually, a world full of, this is also true in sports. If you played basketball in high school and that's the farthest you ever get, you're more likely to be a basketball fan of the NBA. And so I think one of the healthiest things we can do in art and design is encourage broad-based participation, create sort of a entry level that's not super judgmental, that's about the value of creating and doing. That is going to develop the sophisticated connoisseurs of the most masterful instances of craft.
I think you're right. And I'm super excited by that idea. And, I continue to think about a lot of these different circumstances as like a logic problem. And you just kind of keep working at it until you get the right answer. So, you really work with very accessible everyday materials. And sometimes things just kind of wash up, at your house or whatever from a storm, or there are rocks. And so I'm curious about the material choices that you make that shape your design and the experience that you're making. And you just said something also really interesting that I hadn't thought about per se, which is that sometimes you go to a great restaurant and they have access to food that you don't have access to at your local grocery store, right? So there is that kind of variation in terms of the everyday and the available versus something which is more refined or inaccessible. And you're working with materials that other people can find, right? The 5-gallon bucket. How do you choose and why do you think that's important?
Well, it's like I've heard a chef say that when they were testing out sous chefs, they just have them cook an egg, right? Because it shows it's not their grandiose ideas. No, I use tarragon infused in the thing that goes into the thing, right? It's just, have you paid attention to your craft? So I would say the majority of my projects are with accessible materials, concrete, plywood, a lot of 2x4s, basic stuff that you can get from Home Depot. I like that for sort of two reasons. One, I think it encourages, I grew up in sort of kind of a suburban environment. there was no capital A architecture in the town that I grew up in. It was builder grade commercial developments or builder grade houses. So there wasn't, it was a design desert, right? Like literally culturally sophisticated, intentional design did not exist in this place. And I think about like a lot of people, I mean, there was a migration for a while into cities, but there's still so many people that live outside of these hubs that can support cultural sophistication. I think food has gotten a lot better in the suburbs and the surrounding areas. And I think design and art hasn't migrated to the same thing. It doesn't have the same sort of imperative that cuisine does. So that's one of the reasons why for sort of accessible things is I always think back at like, I remember going to the library as a kid and looking at design books and furniture things. We didn't know anyone that had a cool Corbusier chair or anything close to it. You could kind of, what was much more common was like those white plastic lawn chairs. So when I sort of use these materials, I know that Home Depot is ubiquitous. And I really want to put the emphasis on the human creativity and not the access to sort of tools and materials. Purposefully, the I'm in a good position where I could get any power tool company in the world to sponsor me. I choose the most affordable, reliable brand precisely for that. I could use Festool, which is the real fancy woodworking tools. But I think the Toyota Corolla of tools, which is Ryobi, is plenty good enough. And I don't want anyone, I want to remove every opportunity for someone to be like, no, I can't do that because I can't afford that. That still will happen. But I want to reduce those barriers to entry. And so, yeah, a lot of the stuff comes from Depot. And I
Yeah,
see it too
I
when I
love
talk to
that.
creatives is they'll tell you why they can't do something. You see the frustration, the stuck in their face, and you try to unravel it and be like, just do it with what you have and get it done.
Yeah. Yeah. So many things about that. I love this idea of, are you paying attention to your craft, right? Like that's what you're looking for when you're interested in someone. And, my daughter is a finalist for a job and she has an assignment and they said, don't use AI. And because they want to know how she
Right.
thinks, right? And that's what I'm curious about. I remember my job interview for Christie's where they put down 9 picture postcards and fine and decorative arts and told me to put them in chronological order. And I laughed, because I had never been asked to do something like that, but it was about looking and
Right.
thinking and how they were curious how I was making decisions and what I saw. And 2 other things that you just said that I want to emphasize, one is this idea of good enough and in what situations is something good enough and allowing something to be good enough. And I remember years ago, I was given this book called The Good Enough Marriage. I think I was given it by my first husband. And I was like, oh no, like that's not like good enough with marriage. No, thumbs down. Right. But good enough with like the materials to not get stuck. Right. This idea of, perfection being the enemy of progress. Like just, you try something, you keep moving, you iterate and, you learn from it.
I think of it like coffee. I've never had in my entire life, I've never had a cup of coffee that wasn't a net positive or that I didn't enjoy.
Right.
Like, and on construction sites, you have some pretty abysmal coffee in styrofoam cups with powdered creamer, still a net positive. I still enjoy that cup of coffee. Flavorless, too much flavor, styrofoam, afternotes, still enjoyable. Now, just because I enjoy the really bad coffee doesn't make me incapable of differentiating and really appreciating. Coffee is something that I will totally invest money in at the high end when it's available. And I think there's this fear that if we enjoy things that aren't perfect or great, that will somehow blur our ability to differentiate. I think we really learn to appreciate life by being aware of the spectrum of opportunities, not by being consistently within this little elite circle of taste. Bad travel experiences make you appreciate great service. A delayed flight makes you appreciate the one that's on time. And just going through things and being like, this is what is here. And of course, be thoughtful and differentiated when there's options, but don't be constrained by the option that isn't there.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's so well said. So, your work is really at the intersection of so many different places, design, media, education. And I wanted to ask you about whether you see yourself as any or all of these things, a designer, a teacher, or something else entirely. And, as I'm listening, you're clearly very philosophical, and I can hear in the way that you're speaking, and I think that's why we were introduced, this idea of your life practice. So I'm just curious for you to share a little bit about how you think of all those different ways that people could think about who you are, and kind of how you think about yourself and what matters to you.
Yeah, the identities of myself, I don't find that useful, and I find them to be kind of like a stumbling block. I really try to focus on what I'm going to do, not the role that I'm perceived of. When I do think of when people ask me, are you an artist or are you a designer or are you a builder? What the hell are you? I tend to think of it in terms of like profession. What do I do that produces the majority of how I make my living? And so in that case, I would say I'm a designer, catch all sort of creative term. But I think these terms, and it's funny, like one of the things people will be like, no, you're an artist, as if a designer and artist, like there's different cultural value rankings, that if your work reaches a certain perception of beauty, then you get this like new upgraded title. It's like going from a duke to a baron to a king. I don't think that's really true. I'd say designer is the right term because it's what I do the most often. And I'm not a chef, but I'm pretty good at cooking and I can make some great meals. But I don't do it every day. And it's not the thing I'm most known for. So I'm not a chef. I could be if I wanted to. If I dropped everything and did that, I think I could be a chef. But so I tend to think of like the artist versus designer sort of term the same way. I'm also very comfortable. Sometimes people will say, you're not a designer, you're an influencer. And I'm like, okay, that's fine too. That is a way that I make money. I don't think there's I always think it's very telling when people try to focus on how someone makes their money. It's almost like they're acting as if there's a dirtiness to specific types of transactions that don't
Mhm.
affect them, that affect people in these categories. And it's like they're basically trying to call you a whore to like some sort of varying degree and use that as a pejorative. But if you fundamentally believe that the tradespeople deserve as much human dignity and respect as the artists and the writers, and that we're all part of this society that does things that other people can't, then I don't really think any of those terms matter that much. I think it's just about the honesty of being like, I don't really think of myself as an artist, but I make art sometimes, not always. Sometimes I just make a three-legged stool. If someone else wants to call it art, awesome. If someone else wants to call it furniture, also awesome. Someone wants to use it, even better.
Yeah. 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 It's so interesting. I mean, some of these things I think are really about other people. They're not, about us. And I think most interactions I'm finding over time are very much about the other person more than necessarily about ourselves. There are a variety of different ways to learn things in the world, and just kind of being and doing is a great way.
The area where I do think there is like a productive discourse and thought around differentiating semantics is around the difference between creativity and taste. And I think this is like the area, the sort of culture we're in right now is mistaking having great taste as being creative. And I think this is sort of a challenge of the DJ era, right? Is I don't make new music, but I do make experiences for people. And I see that as perfectly legitimate. And I do respect that sort of art and craft, but it's created this sort of gray area, right? Like, are you an artist if you create a really good Pinterest board about art? Not for me to decide, but I think people are mistaking consumption with production. And I think creativity is always about production and taste is about consumption. Now, having great taste can inform your creativity and make you more precise and targeted, but it doesn't make you creative to have great taste. The same way, like eating at great restaurants could inspire you to be a better chef, but it doesn't make you a better chef.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I do think, sometimes these semantical conversations or distinctions, they don't really matter. but other ones really do matter. And I think that kind of blurring of how words are used, I'm really interested in language. And I feel like it started happening definitely with youth culture, right? Where words get repurposed and things that used to be bad are good. And they're the same words, right? But then within that, these new words come up, and then some of the old words still have some of the same meaning, but they're being changed. And I think there's a lot to unpack around language and who's using it for what purposes. And there's something very important about what you just said, which is being able to kind of tease apart the meaning rather than just the language.
Yeah. It was funny. A friend of mine recommended to me, you got to read that Rick Rubin book, The Creative Act. So eventually I read it. And I'm like, this book is to creativity what Dr. Oz is to medicine. Like, this is the Oprahfication and into sort of self-help mantras that make you feel like you're doing something, but it's mostly placebo effect and kind of full of crap.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I think we get to think about, what matters to us. And if you have a platform like you do, you have an opportunity to kind of point out some different problematics or differentiations that people can consider, right? And, what is actual production and what does it mean to be creative? And it's interesting because for me, I had a very traditional view of what art was when I first started out. And it's definitely gotten much bigger and expanded over time, and that feels great. But the idea between, I should say, and instead of but, the space between creative production and art and how they can be used sometimes kind of interchangeably, or people say, oh, art with a lowercase a, but what, what does that matter, right? So it's this idea of like artist, designer, chef, baker, gardener, whatever it is, right? Like it's about making things.
This even exists, and all of these things internal to an area I think are healthy, and the thinking about the differentiation is good, right? Like I hear it with engineers where they're like, that's not engineering. It's not reached a significant scale and technical expertise to justify it. And then I'm like, but can you design a rock bridge? Well, that technology is kind of, it's interesting because it's like, I love these discussions. I think when the discussions are to help you position yourself within something, it's super productive. I like talking about with my friends about the differences between art, design, and all these things, only in the respect that it helps me sort of position what I can do next. If you find yourself in these conversations where you come out less likely to take action, or less or more confused and less feeling like you should do, or just more constrained, I think you're doing it wrong. The purpose of these discussions is to sort of create opportunities, not to narrow them into sort of culturally, you have to reach this level of cultural significance. So yeah, it's the fun conversations over a glass of wine or two with like people in the industry. But I find the sort of public discourse about who or who doesn't deserve classification to be less interesting. And also, kind of like the Academy Awards, it's really interesting to look at the most prestigious award for film. But then you look back and you look at what was actually significant to film in that moment. They don't often correlate too much.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the Banksy example is a great one because it's like my friends that are heavily involved in the art worlds have a lot to say about what he is and what he isn't, or what she is or what she isn't. I'm still not totally convinced on the identity thing, but I think it's reached such a point of escape velocity culturally that they're going to have to talk about it for a long period of time.
Yeah. I think sustained dialogue is great, and I'm a big fan of the yes and instead of the, either or, and being able to, I think that's why I'm interested in the blurring of boundaries, because it feels productive, it feels expansive, it feels open to me. And that's what I want more of, rather than, constriction and lessening and minimizing. I'm really good with people getting to do what makes them happy and brings them joy. And sharing it with other people as best as possible. All right, a couple of short answer questions for you. I used to say like one word answers, but it's really hard to do
Sure.
that. All right, a material you love working with.
Rocks. Right now, it's rocks, the most primitive thing we can imagine. And it's so funny to watch. I think everyone's gone on a vacation where they brought a little rock or pebble home. And
Mhm.
so when a project starts with me collecting a rock in the desert, it just seems to like tickle people's imagination because it feels on one hand so primitive and so relatable.
So true. So true. I was thinking about this idea of keeping a rock in my back pocket to remind me of something or someone.
So the way to turn this into a DIY that anyone can do, a lot of people have cabinets in their home. A lot of the handles on those cabinets are nondescript and non-remarkable. A lot of people have picked up nice little smooth pebbles on trips. If you epoxy a bolt to the back of a pebble, you can make custom little pebbled handles for each one of your cabinet doors.
That's so cool. That's a takeaway. I
Yeah.
love it. Okay. A tool you can't live without.
Right now, it's called an angle grinder. I think this is like tools. I mean, the history of art is defined by the tools and materials that were available. The angle grinder, it's not a new tool, but the improvement of battery technology has created handheld power it's almost like it's a tool that can fit in a backpack. And it only has a little circular blade, 4.5 inches, but I can cut through solid steel. I can cut through rock with something that can fit in a backpack. I was talking to a lock manufacturer and they've kind of given up on padlocks because with a battery powered tool that you can get for about $75 from Home Depot, you can cut through any steel lock in seconds. And now that you have like, as batteries get better, the ability to power these tools for longer amounts of times. And so it's interesting. People keep saying that, robots and 3D printers are going to take over the sort of fabrication world. It's not, because cheapness always sort of wins. And while 3D printers have gotten a lot better, traditional power tools have also improved. The blades are sharper and they have harder steel and ceramic coatings that make them more efficient for cutting and last longer. The batteries last longer. The electric motors have improved dramatically. And so there's all these different areas of each of these power tools that improves like 2 to 5% every couple of years. But that really compounds over time, and you can do incredible things with really inexpensive tools like an angle grinder.
Fascinating. Okay. A space, home studio or otherwise, that inspires you.
Right now, it's the openness of the desert, right? California is known for being one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. And what I'm really excited about that I find inspiring is that where I'm at in the Joshua Tree area is actually two things. One, it's incredibly affordable for California. So I just had some interior design friends, the great firm Gray Space. They just bought a home and moved out here. I have a blacksmith friend who's an excellent steel fabricator. This is the place in California he could afford. It also has cultural street cred. And these two things, I mean, this is how Brooklyn kind of got started or really sort of blew up. So I think the the high desert of the Joshua Tree area is really inspiring right now because we're getting more and more full-time creatives and artists out here. We have some, original people that have been out here like Sibel Rowe, an incredible large-scale ceramicist that talks like a pirate and fantastic in general. You should definitely have her on. She's a riot. So you have this sort of legacy artists that have been out here for decades, but you have this new kind of creative class sort of moving out here for affordability reasons and also bolstered by community. So I'm finding much like, U2 or The Doors or Dr. Seuss, I'm finding the Joshua Tree area particularly inspiring.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, the landscape there is so amazing. And I agree. Okay. So, one thing that you think people misunderstand about design.
Well, I think that the bastardization of design is when it started getting used to connote high end, like this is designer handbag, right? I think that is a misunderstanding. I often think that the low end things at scale are the most designed. I am a firm believer that a Toyota Corolla is a better design than a Ferrari. The Ferrari is just a more finicky thing that works less often for a narrower group of people whose taste is more easy to understand than a Toyota Corolla. So I think the Toyota Corolla is excellent designs and the Ferrari is kind of mid.
Of that. Okay. A habit that keeps you creative.
At dinner parties with other creatives. And I think in my and 30s, I was way too like, I got to do this. I got to prove this. I got to make this. I got to do the next thing and be more productive and be more efficient and learn more tips and tactics for producing more. As I've gotten into the second half of my 40s, I realized like how much innovation comes just over conversation with people that you trust and respect. And so we've started implementing kind of weekly dinner parties at my ranch here in Joshua Tree. And the best ones are where you take someone that's more into high end of design, working with fancy clients, doing really cool projects. And they're at the same dinner table with someone that's just really nice with welding, like really good at it, but not maybe have the same sort of cultural sophistication in terms of taste. That actually creates great collaborative moments because they need each other, right? And they learn instantly from each other. We also do a little show and tell segment where people will bring a random tool or material or found object or bottle of wine, whatever it is, to the dinner parties. And they're normally like 4 to 7 people. And it's been a great sort of productive creative practice.
Love that. I love that. Okay. Last question that I ask everyone. Why does art matter?
It's funny. I just did a video where the art matters the same way dessert does. Because if it didn't exist, it would mean we were still living like cave people, just fighting for survival. And just fighting for survival isn't inspiring. It's pathetic, right? We're past that. Now, it's funny. Everyone I meet, no matter how successful, feels like they're struggling. And that makes me think that almost everyone can benefit from acknowledging that dessert is awesome. And there's so many reasons why we shouldn't have desserts. Oh, it's not fitting my macros and it's not. But removing celebration and things that are a little bit looser with the why, I think is like kind of where happiness comes from. So I'd say dessert matters, art matters because happiness does.
Yeah. So great. Yeah. Being a little bit looser with the why. I think that's really interesting. I think that's a phrase I'm going to take away and sit with.
Yeah, the Simon Sinek book starts with why is fantastic as like an anchoring point. But we can be specific with it. We can zoom in, we can zoom out, we can squint our eyes and blur it a little bit, and we can control how tightly we follow the why.
Yeah. So interesting. Thank you so much for your conversation today. I really enjoyed it. I yeah,
My
I
pleasure.
really love it when there's things to tangibly take away, both to make and to think about. So, I'm gonna stop the recording, but if you wait to exit, just till yours is uploaded, that
Yeah,
would be great.
very, very familiar with the whole Riverside things.
Okay, hold on one
Yeah.
sec.